Uh, so, a very warm welcome to all of you to the book launch today of Professor Nandini Sen's debut short stories, The Second Wife and Other Stories. Before we get into the book launch and the discussion, I would like to just say a few words about Rising Asia Foundation and Rising Asia Journal, under whose auspices this book launch is being done. And this is the first one that Rising Asia is doing. Rising Asia is a 3-year-old foundation and journal that has so far produced as many as 9 issues, and over 2,000 pages have been produced of rigorously peer-reviewed material. We have authors from the West as well as Southeast Asia and India. So we will be doing these launches on a regular basis. So with these few words, I'll introduce the anchor for this evening, Professor Julie Banerjee Mehta, who has a PhD and MA degrees from the University of Toronto, Department of English, and the Department of South Asian Studies. And her previous master's is from Jadavpur University. Professor Mehta has taught at the University of Toronto and York University in Toronto, is currently teaching as faculty at Loreto College in Calcutta. She is the author of several books, one of them being The Dance of Life, which is a history of the culture and of the genocide and the resurrection of Cambodian dance. With those few words, I will pass the microphone on to Professor Mehta.
Thank you, Harish. So, a very warm welcome again, and I'm thrilled actually that this launch is more of a Ghorowa launch than I ever imagined or I've ever done. And it suits the occasion fine because Nandini is more of a sister now. We've been talking about her book for the last 2 years since she wrote it, and it was at the Bengal Club that we discussed the book, and Anasuya will live about 1,000,000 years because Anasuya was my right hand at the Bengal Club when we chose this book during the COVID, and we decided we were going to really deconstruct it. Then to have the author there was a double whammy, and we really enjoyed the book club discussion, from issues of feminism to issues of poverty, underprivileged living, to her very interesting, accessible style. What is very, significant, I should say, for me today is that Professor Sangyukta Dasgupta, who's been an idol for many of us, is also almost done some of the same things, and in whose footsteps I will say Nandini has travelled. Around the same time, Sangyukta Di, we launched your book at the Bengal Club. Do you remember? And one of the stories in that book is an unforgettable story and echoes the same issues of womanhood and deprivation, dysfunctionality, and yet also the concept of how matriarchs become patriarchs in our society. And her book is very available, Amazon e pawa jay. And I would recommend that if you are reading Nandini's The Second Wife and Other Stories, you should definitely turn your sights on It Begins at Home. So with those, few introductory remarks on the two ladies who are sitting here, both feminists, both of whom I admire, I'm also very privileged to have with me Shuddhadeep from is lately from the Jadavpur University, JUCL Jetake Boli Amra, the Comparative Literature Department. He has been a shining student from the time that he was a master student, and Harish and I had the privilege to listen to his papers, which were definitely of a doctoral level, if not a postdoc level. And Shuddhadeep has made us all proud. He got his MPhil. No, sorry. No, your MPhil was from.
I did not.
You didn't do your. Imagine. So he's a direct entry PhD to Rutgers University. Rutgers University, লতায় পাতায় আমাদের কিরম connection দেখো. Rutgers University was the university where a dear friend and a colleague of Nandini's did her PhD in English, and that is Ajanta Datta. So we both went to Loreto here together. Yes, I know. Yeah. So, cutting to the chase, if you notice what I have to say about Nandini, you will also hear me echo some of the stuff about Songjukta De. So Nandini Sen is a professor at Delhi University. She was a fellow at the prestigious Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. And she's also the recipient of the Charles Wallace Fellowship for Academics in London, the Ambassador for Peace Prize, and for educating slum dwellers. And you also got the Write India Award, right, for creative writing? Yeah. And your work is on the diaspora and African studies. Yes. And Buchi Amachetta, is very much your favorite. Professor Songjukta Dasgupta, as I said, I remember her 38 years ago, and then it has been a continuous building of that relationship since I came back from my mother. And she's a poet, a short story writer. Who doesn't know Songjukta De? Critic, translator, member, General Council of Sahitya Academy in New Delhi. She's the president of the Intercultural Poetry Library of Kolkata. And many of the friends that we share, including Paramita Mukherjee Malik, who's a poet, is a great admirer of Songjukta De. She received the WEI Kamala Das Poetry Award in 2020, has published 27 books, translated into German, Siberian, and so many other European languages. So, maybe we should start with a round robin of questions from the panel. A couple of, trying to put the writer and her work so we can excavate what she is saying. And then we'll open it up to the floor. Nandini, my question to you is not a difficult one, but one that should possibly uncover your focus on women and how it became a piece of fiction. Welcome, Anju. Anju Munshi has also been one of the first interlocutors, if you remember, during the time that we explored your book. So, what made you want to write a collection of short stories on things that you saw and you believed in?
Thank you, Julie Di. And she's right, this program has really become Ghoroa because I'm home. Interestingly, I've never lived in Kolkata, but Kolkata has been home. And so I think it's a fitment of things that family, friends, and some of my students who interestingly now live here with their spouses who have been taught by my colleagues here. So it's like, it's we've sort of come a full circle. So let me start before I answer you, but let me do what I should be doing right at the outset. So thank you, Rising Asia Foundation, for having me, and I'm told that this is the first book that you all are launching. So I'm very proud and I'm very grateful. And to this couple, to Professor Harish and Professor Julie, I'm absolutely indebted, because they have, been great cheerleaders for my book. And we've had the Bengal Club doing it online, and then Telegraph covering it. So it's all happened. But I still felt I wanted to meet people face to face here in Kolkata. See, in Delhi, we were doing, several launches have happened. And I mean, the launch happened, and then several readings happened, because that's where I live. But I always wanted something happening here in Kolkata. So we planned towards it. Somehow didn't fructify. And this time it came together. I realized people are, the room is small but I'm so grateful that all of you came in, and I'm so grateful that, like I said, friends, family, everyone coming together. This makes it so special for me. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. To now answer what Professor Julie was asking me, so how did this book come together? Now, that is a little difficult to answer, because the book has been baking for the longest time, or the book has been in making, because there's a lot of young people here, let me tell you. So I don't do what I did. So I would write things, and then because I'm trained to critique, I mean, being an English professor, that's the training that so you're doing it all the time. So I would read what I would have written, and I would delete it. So guys, be critical, but don't delete. And I've deleted so many drafts that I can't even begin to count and tell you what I have done and why I did what I did, because I always looked at myself as somebody writing on diaspora or gender, something academic, but definitely not creative. That was what Charlotte Bronte did, or that was what Shakespeare did, or Mahashweta Devi did. I don't do it. I read it, I critique it, I talk about it. That's the first mistake that none of you aspiring writers should ever do. Coming back, so why talk about women? Because I think that's so inbuilt in my system. So if you allow a little bit of something from my childhood, so I saw a lot of, even as a child, I think I was very sensitive to the fact that there was a lot of what we did. What was told to us was very different from what was happening before us. I used to see a grandmother of mine who would, she would be the matriarch of the family, take care of a joint family, as it was called. And when she was serving her family, she would pick up the biggest piece of fish and say, "This is for my boro chele." The next one would be for my mejo chele. Next, third one would be for my boro nati. Fourth one would be for mejo nati. And I was this little girl, and I thought there was everything wrong with this. And this is when I'm not particularly fond of that fish, or I wanted to eat any of it. But I just thought this is not right. And if I tried telling her it was not right, she told me, "With your nose in your book, and you're going to get fat glasses, and nobody will marry you." Now, when you're very young, you really don't take that as a threat. Even as an older person, I never took it as a threat. So I did get those thick glasses. And I still had my nose in my book. But finally, when I went to college, I think, is when I got the words with which to critique this, what I had been sensing was happening around me. That is when I formed the words. And once I formed the words, the stories were very easy, because they came from all of you, people I was interacting with, people I knew. And I saw this happening everywhere. So the stories are about this Gurgaon posh, wife of a corporate, and what happens to her. Something I see happening around me on a daily basis. And it seems so Mrs. Dalloway-like, planning parties and ensuring that the party goes off all well. And then being rebuked by that husband, or not being on the same page, or being told for who you are. So, and then, of course, the older stories, then the nationalist movement, because one has grown up on them. So the stories, like I said, they've been living with me, they've been gestating within me for like the longest time. And if you give me a minute of indulgence, I'll tell you how the book came about. Here I have to acknowledge, I've been told the one criticism I've received about this book is they aren't enough good men. So since I didn't put them on paper, I need to go on record. So a few good men I see around here. The one good man I definitely owe the book to was a friend of mine who wanted me to write and said, send me a story. And then he didn't respond for about 24 hours. So I was like, now he'll never talk to me again. We'll never talk. This is the end of our friendship. He hates what I've written. And then he reverts and says, this is not going to go anywhere. You need to bring out your stories as a collection. So then was enterprising enough to go and find me what do you call them, the book, the publisher. So the publisher came into place and all of that. So the book happened because of the good men around me, even though there might not be too many in the book. So that's how the book happened.
Lovely. I have, and so you can talk about another good man in your life who, I think I'm loud enough. Oh, okay. So your Didun was the one who gave you that little spark to say, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to find my voice, which is going to empower the ones who don't have a voice. But your grandfather from your father's side was a different piece of cake. And he was one of your best friends. Very briefly, if you can share with all of us, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so I had a Dadu, which many of you know him. Behind his back, people called him Tiger Chaudhary, and not in a very nice manner. So when he would visit us, later on he lived with us for throughout his life. But in the earlier phase of my life, he used to come and visit. So the time when he used to be visiting, none of my friends or my teachers visited my house because Tiger Chaudhary was there. But Tiger Chaudhary had some very interesting things. He had a huge almirah full of books, and he let me read those books irrespective of my age. So I could just pick up any book and read. And we could have any discussion. Now, as a much older person, I realize that some of those discussions might not have been correct by any social standard, because Dadu's discussion would be about the Mahabharat. He talked about Ambalika and how, this... the rishi was called in and so on, and they did not enjoy the act, and then what happened. So all of these discussions probably happening with a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. So I can't say I understood every word, but I knew that there were problem areas. Again, putting me onto the thing that epics need to be questioned. Epics are not a given. So and then they would range from Shamiji to Aurobindo to you name it. So there was this vast expanse of things that one learned and read and sort of encountered from a very young age. So I think that's how I was put on the path, so to say, of a certain kind of academic rigor instilled in me, which saw me becoming who I am. So yeah, I think very definitely I would owe it to him.
Very comprehensive. Shami Juktati, please go right ahead and ask your question, make a comment, whatever.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, the initiators of Rising Asia Foundation. It's always good to witness something rising, yes, in very troubled times. So I hope this will rise, and we will look up to Rising Asia Foundation. And of course, seeing the full house and seeing the enthusiasm and all the eyes absolutely glued to the author, who incidentally is not a Kolkata person, but from Delhi. She said that she'd never lived in Kolkata. However, it's such a joy to be here this evening. And the first time Julie contacted me, we have done a few things together, mostly online. Yes, not that we did mind that untouchable relationship. but it's good to hug also, yes, at the right time. So, and so Julie has been a friend for a very, very long time, and she even mentioned the number of decades. I don't want you to be imaginative. and and what really struck me when Julie said that, well, you should read Nandini Sen's book and then we can get together and maybe launch the book somewhere, probably at Oxford. That was the initial plan. And then, of course, it happened in Bengal Club. And what I'm very very struck about is Julie said that we deconstructed the book. And yet she's here next to the author. And there are others also who were part of that particular program, and they have been here, and they are not right in the last row. They are right in front. So I think it was quite empathetic deconstruction rather than otherwise. And of course, I have read the book because Julie, sometimes decides to set me homework. And she says, read it up. It won't take very long. And so a few times I obeyed. Then I thought, no, this, because I am really incorrigibly lazy. So I thought, if now every time that Julie sets me homework, should I listen or not? আমি তো মা বাবার কথাই জীবনে শুনিনি, তো আর জুলির কথা আর শুনতে পারলাম না। So, as a result, there are times, of course, if the book is absolutely a captivating one, then of course it's very difficult to say no. But there are other times when I had to say no to Julie, which really breaks my heart. I could have learnt a lot. But the second wife and other stories has 11 stories. And one wouldn't really believe that these are debut short stories. First of all, in terms of the genre short stories, I think, it has been neglected a lot, and there have been many comments about Rabindranath should have got a second Nobel on the short stories that he wrote, about 98 of them, if I'm not mistaken. Now, one reason for the short stories never being very appealing to Western readers is because the West is not really interested in the micro-politics of daily living of the South Asian. That is something that it is not about failed translation. It is about the lack of interest. Whereas poetry and spiritualism, with which India is branded even today, is something that was also very common. And remember 1912, just before this First World War was happening, spiritualism worked much better. Yes? So altogether, the fact that these are stories written in English, mostly with Bengali protagonists, mostly about Bengal. And as I was reading, I thought, the words are English, but I'm reading Bengali stories. And this sort of embeddedness of Bengali culture in these stories, I thought was remarkable. Also, because she sort of covered a wide trajectory. It is not about the urbanized upper middle class Bengalis only, but there were ordinary working class Bengalis and middle class Bengalis and the lower middle class Bengalis. Especially, there is one story that would make you sit up and take notice. I remember Joya Mitra having a story of this sort. It is Nobonita. And I think all of you need to pay attention to that story. There are several stories which are about resistance. There are several stories which are resilient. But there are other stories also where she's not so harsh. Yes? And so those are the stories, because a woman leaving the home is something that we know from the doll's house. Yes? And then, of course, there is Rabindranath with Sri Patro, and then Ashapurna with Pratham Pratishruti and Bokul Katha. So all, and of course, the Shubharnalata. That is a very, very powerful text. But here, the explorations in gender and class, caste is not addressed in a big way. And I don't know whether it was irony there in your glossary. In next to Brahmin, she writes the uppermost class. So, so, and Tagore had himself said, Esho Brahman Shuchi Kori Mon. Nobody else was asked to go in for a cleansing. Only Brahmins. Esho Brahman Shuchi Kori Mon. Dharahat Shabakar. And so this uppermost class, rang a bell. And so I think because, yeah, so the cleansing process is necessary for Brahmins. Tagore understood that way back at a time when probably the Hindu revivalist movement was happening at the same time. So I think, and also these are all the stories are more or less of the late 20th century. I do not see the stories as representing the millennials. That is, the last 20 or 30 years. I do not see the stories representing or critiquing the millennials, but it's very 20th century stories. And the Nakshal movement stories, I was a student at Presidency at that time. So I quite remember what we went through. And there are so many stories, and I do not want to go into those, but it was a difficult time. And that particular story, which is your first short story here, is very remarkable, but it starts in a fantastic way because she sort of plays around with the Man Booker Prize and calls it some Man Brooks or something. And then she says that at last somebody from South Asia may just get it because the agent is good, active. Without a literary... Yeah. That's what she wrote. So, and after retirement, I can just say about anything, Something I would have been much more conscious because I wouldn't have wanted to lose my job. Loss of a job is no Fab India and Konishko. So, yes. So, these stories, I would, if you have read them, I'm sure you would want to reread them. If you haven't read them, I think because these stories are worded in a very lucid manner, extremely readable, lucid, not dense at all, quite linear, but at the same time there is a ring of sincerity in the representation, that the author is being very genuine in her responses to characters and situations. And there I would like to, because of the varied representations, it's not just one story being repeated with different characters. How did you plan your stories? Did they all arrive at the same time and you wrote all 11 in, say, about 6 or 7 months? Or did you take a long time to do that?
So thank you so much, ma'am. No, they took forever. And like I said, I was not planning a book. I was not planning anything. I was writing and deleting for the better part. At one point of time, I sent a story again just because I thought, chalo karte hain types. To the Times, they were having a competition, and I got the shock of my life, and I won an award. But even that wasn't remotely enough to make me think of myself as an author. Like I said, my authors were Tagore. My authors were like, আমি author to হয় না. I'm critic, I write diaspora, I write gender, I write this. So like I said, for the longest period, I never thought of myself to be even able to call myself an author. So the stories stayed in my laptop securely, and I would never look at them. barring to delete some if I felt like it. So it was very random. But like I said, the stories remained with me. So when you talk about my sincerity and genuineness, if I would completely agree with you there, because the thoughts, and I think the one thing that you would have noticed as you read, that the thoughts remain very constant. The periods might change, the characters obviously change, and the time frame, but what and how I feel about women kind of remains very constant. And I didn't. Another thing that was by choice. I didn't want to have very neat endings. I have had people pointing this out, that particularly Nobunita, since you talk about it. I remember a group of readers who felt very bad that Nobunita does not kill at the end. I mean, they wanted a proper closure. Instead, I have Nobunita walking. I mean, I'm giving away the ending, but anyways, you'll still read the story, I hope. So I don't make her so I didn't find neatly tied endings to the story, because I feel life does not give you neatly tied, wrapped in a cellophane paper ending. Life, it's very, and then that's where I also wanted the readers to come in. So you have a take in the matter. What do you feel about it? What do you think about it? So I didn't want to have very definitive endings, and I don't, and that's something I don't believe in again. So I think where the stories have come from is from my feminist consciousness, my identity as a woman, as a professional, as somebody who engages with women on a daily basis. I teach in a women's college. I talk to women at all given points of time, and I see what they are going through. I've seen, and I think, like I said, from being a very young person, I've been very observant about what goes on around me. And I think that has pained me endlessly. The part about the millennials that you talk about, now there I would love to talk about, the newer generation and what they're doing. But I'm afraid I don't know them well enough, I feel, because the second book maybe, yes. So
Some research required.
some research required, but again, I feel I have to be situated somewhere in my story. So that to be situated there in the story, I think I'll need a little more than research. I do see young women around me all the time, and very smart and very eloquent and and way smarter than me. And some of them coming up with advice which I could have never thought of. So my 17-year or 18-year-old student tells me, मैम आपने क्या गलती करी, आपको पता है क्या करना चाहिए था. I don't know why the topic came up. So क्या करना था, you should go around with whoever you wish to, but marry the person your parents choose. आपने तो उल्टा काम किया. So this comes from one of my young students when I was very young myself. I don't know where she thought she should. And students do that. All of you are teachers here. So students tell us when you're looking good, when you're not, what eyeliners to wear. So, So this was this kid from... so she said, ये तो बहुत गलत है. And the class, that particular class, seemed to quite agree with her that ma'am had not done things the way she should have done. So, and since then we have moved on, and we have some, militant feminists in my class who would, so since we also teach different kinds of classes, different kinds of, teaching in a government institution, Delhi University being one, you have students coming in from all backgrounds. You have students, and then the courses determine which student takes what. So, you get to teach this large section of people, and so much evolves from the classrooms on a daily basis. So I think that's what finds a mention or is there in my consciousness somewhere, which comes out. And then, of course, the readings that I do. I think this book is more about the person that I became through my readings and through who I am. The next one, maybe, I learn from my students and enough to be able to write about them.
So the next question would be a very short one. Is there a favorite story among the 11? Or? Because all of them are, of course, your own children. Yes. And so among them, is there a favorite one?
That's a tough one, Prof, because everyone says you can't choose between your kids. But like you said, Nobunita, I think a lot of people have loved. Queen KK has been a hot favorite. I think that has been an absolute favorite. Somebody lipsticks, one section, yes, one section of lipstick has been liked by say like-minded people. Queen KK has been liked by people who want to make cinema or serials, or so different people and different reaction to the stories. And Thammi has been a hot favorite with my students, more so because they read Amitav Ghosh and there was a Thakuma figure there, and then comes a Thammi. So I don't know, it seemed to kind of, that became a huge favorite with some of them. So I don't know, I really wouldn't know which to prioritize.
Has been waiting for a long time. Absolutely, yes. Shuddhadeep has done some incredible work. I think he's into his first year of the dissertation at Rutgers University. And I'm interested in finding out from him. We have a time score sometimes. We talked about not knowing about millennials, not knowing how they'd react, etc. But there are some things which are almost, evergreen issues with women and their spirit. And he knows I'm very conscious of the contributions of women like Sharala Sundari Devi, Rasha Sundari Devi. Absolutely. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that, Shuddhadeep, and how that would connect to women fighting back in this book. And then your take on where this collection of short stories stands today.
Thank you, Julie. Firstly, let me acknowledge that I'm very nervous to be speaking alongside my professors Julie and Shangjukta. But then, Nandini, you are already an author now, and there's no denying to it, and you have to face the perils. The first peril being that you are being read. Yes, I'll actually try to respond to the Second Wife and Other Stories more as a reader, and I would read out my observations and then end with a couple of questions for you. So on reading the stories, I would respond to your question at the end, ma'am.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. On reading the stories one after the other, one would note that some central characters who are very much present in the beginning of the stories begin to fade or disappear as the stories progress. In spite of the disappearance from the narrative space of the story, the character lives on throughout as a trace. A trace so powerful that it sometimes turns into a catalyst to the formation of the narrative. Sarah, in The Sapphire, in the first story, the writer's agent, for example, without whom the story/history would never have been inscribed. Nandini writes, Sarah is 18 years younger to me and fiercely independent. She has refused to move in with me. She comes and goes as she pleases. Her lovemaking is as unpredictable as she is. Of late, I have started depending entirely on her advice for my writing. Now, refusal to stay is important here. She comes and goes as she pleases, like the wind. And the writer is dependent on this refusal. Similarly, in the second story, Nobunita's father, like Sarah, is an important presence. Yet again, he disappears. He never wanted her daughter to leave the suburban space for the city. Another kind of refusal born out of a sense of knowing. Nobunita leaves her town. The father is totally absent in the latter half of the narrative, but is also significantly present, but only as an unacknowledged trace. Joy, a scholar in the story Lipstick, is another such trace, an agent in the production of the new woman who would be able to come out of the clutches of heteronormativity to reconcile with her son. Now, reconcile, let's focus on the prefix re here, because you end the story with the phrase new woman, and you have worked on 19th century woman, and we know about how the woman was recasted from Prachina to Novina. And also you look at the closet from the other side in the story. Thammi's death in the middle of the next story in the collection again allows the unraveling of the mother of the narrator to transcend her class privilege and position and respond responsibly to the call of the subaltern women collective. The leaving trace of Thammi results again in another form of reconciliation across class categories. Many such examples can be posited, But what I'm trying to do here as a reader of literary texts is to oppose, and oppose strongly, any form of characterological reading that the stories, being named after the character sometimes, might otherwise seem to insist, because the stories have a lot more to it. Rather, the setting, the socio-political context within which the story is located, becomes more important and deserves to be noticed. Let me just cite one example from the story Thammi. So, it is one such night when the narrator is at the grandmother's place, and after an entire day of playing and mingling with the maid's family, I read, "At night, when I would fall asleep from sheer exhaustion, I would feel Ma's fingers running through my hair." Now, this is a signifier of affection. My sister loves it, who is in the audience here. Now, many of us love this kind of a caress. After a whole days of exhaustion, at a time when everything else takes a halt, a moment of peace, the mother caresses her daughter. But wait until the next line. "I would feel Ma's fingers running through my hair. She was convinced I had lice due to my proximity with Lalita," the maid's daughter. Instantly, the signified is transformed from affection to contempt and disgust for a certain class. The evidence becomes stronger in the next paragraph when we find the mother scrubbing out the lower class, and the caste is again not mentioned, as Shankar says, germs from her daughter's body passionately. "When it was time to return, I would cry all the way back to Kolkata. Ma would start cheering up the minute our car hit the highway. My misery and Ma's merriment seemed almost inversely proportionate. Back home, she would be her usual happy self. I would be subjected to 2 rounds of body and hair scrubbing till she was satisfied I wasn't carrying any germs from my stay in Thamma's house." Speaking of caste politics, however, Matungo's inclusion, I think, as the narrator of Koike's story, is very important. Because Matungo, who was born of who was a Chandal by birth and desired to become a Brahmin but could not become one towards the end, perhaps. Now I'm only talking about the Ur text, or if that exists in Ramayana. Now, therefore, somehow when Matungo makes persistent efforts to learn the story of Koikei, who is also an unbecomed character, it formulates a logic of solidarity that is much beyond just the notion of romantic love. What I find particularly of interest in Nandini's collection is both perhaps an advantage and a disadvantage to the stories. The author is very much aware of her location, not just a geographical location, but also of the locations of a class and language. All the stories are about the middle class, often the upper middle class. Nandini seems to have no intention to appropriate the voice of the subaltern women. They are always seen, read, and written about from the lens of the third person. Now, while this might seem ethical, the unresolved bond of intimacy, of decentering, immediately and urgently questions the ethical. No doubt, the narrator and the mother in the Thammi story responds to the call of the crisis of the subaltern. But they also again become the NGO-based saviors, the good women whose complexities of intimacy remains hidden and perhaps lost in the lucidity of the story's language. I liked Nandini's emphasis of the indigenous identity of the maid in the final story, the Santhal maid. And I liked how there was no pretense in articulating that in spite of a certain form of acceptance of the Santhal woman by the Roys living in this sprawling bungalow, I quote her only and ultimate fate would be death. However, because I knew Nandini has worked on Mahashweta and Adivashi politics, I was left craving for a more nuanced description of the desires and tensions, at least in language, of the Adivasi woman in the final story. Anyway, to wrap up, I would like to read the first and the last few lines from Tilly Olsen's I Stand Here Ironing, which I think speaks of female angst, agency, and domesticity in the most literary way possible, topics dealt with by Nandini in her debut book. I stand here ironing, and what you asked me moves tormented back and forth with the iron. I wish you would manage the time to come in and talk with me about your daughter. I'm sure you can help me understand her. She's a youngster who needs help and whom I am deeply interested in helping. And the story ends thus: let her be, so all that is in her will not bloom. But in how many does it? There is still enough left to live by. Only help her to know. Help make it so there is cause for her to know that she is more than this dress on the ironing board, helpless before the ironing. Congratulations, Nandini, on the launch of your debut book. I hope your upcoming writings will help us to observe and understand that there is more than the dress on the ironing board, and will speak more of feminine and feminist agency in more subtle and nuanced ways. Thank you. Well, I have some questions as well.
Yeah, sure.
So the second story, the second wife, the title story of your book, that seems to have great resemblance to the Ombika Parbo of Subarnalata. And you have talked about your influence of Ashapurna Devi in the interview with Julie ma'am. So if you could speak a little bit more about that influence. Was it just Ashapurna, or was it the like Rasha Sundari, Nistarini, Ashapurna, Nabonita? If it was the entire line of Yeah, so that would be my first question. I would ask you the two more questions so they can respond together. About the city, in Indian writing in English, mostly that deals with Calcutta, we have seen the description of of the city, and not of the suburbs mostly. While you dwell between both the suburban space and the city, they're sometimes restricted within some adjectives like sprawling bungalow, modest house, or like a palatial house, modest house. So I was wondering how you were trying to deal with the suburban space in your story when you were comparing it with Park Circus, Baliganj, and the spaces like that. And the final question was that you have touched upon various topics like marital rape, trafficking, Naxalbari Andolon, to name a few. Were you ever driven by the agendas before writing? Was your intention to compose a literary story, or more to establish a particular subject or agenda? 3 questions.
Okay, so tough ones. I don't know in which order to answer this, but thanks. That was a very comprehensive, and I know who to ask to write the next review, because there's some magazines who are looking for reviews of the book. So, so when you ask me where does the influence come from, now very difficult. All of them, I would say. It's a whole litany. It is unfortunately, unlike all of you, I presume you would have studied here, so you would have read Bangla literature in a certain, I would think, in a certain chronological fashion. I unfortunately just picked up books at random and read. So my understanding and my the trajectory has been rather chaotic, but the influences remain. So yes, Subarnalata has been a great favorite, and after writing it, I think I saw the echoes, but I think that's because those stories live within you. People have told me that they see a lot of Rabindranath in them, and the stories resonated with somebody and reminded him of Rabindranath. So all I would say is I think that whole thing just sort of remains with you. The concept of the childless woman, the concept of, okay, and then there were, like I said, instances which I knew of. Now, the wife dies and the sister-in-law, the sister is married to the person concerned, and no questions asked. The families are quite happy. They don't have to pay dowry for the second marriage. So those kind of things one did hear about, not that one saw, but did hear about in stories. Like I said, I might have fought with my Didun all my life, but I was the greatest sort of sucker for her stories. So I think people who profess their love for her wouldn't know as many stories as I do, because I stuck to her, and heard so many stories. So those were things that one, so they did happen. So then I think it was a coming together of all of that. Sorry, what was the second and the third? The city and the suburbs. So I, like I said, have never lived in the city. Very briefly, I've come and gone. But I've lived in the suburbs quite a bit. When I say suburbs, not really suburbs of Kolkata, but outskirts. So outskirts where you would have those bungalows, and, when you have parents who work with the government, you have government bungalows. And there's a certain kind of lifestyle that develops around those government bungalows. So I would see families where, servants would be taken on, where you congratulated the family for being very altruistic and taking care of somebody. But very often it would be that they needed a servant, and this was a easy, simple way of keeping somebody, and you didn't need to. There was an agenda behind it, good or bad. Is not for us to judge, but the agenda was very definitely there, and so one has seen or heard or known such things happening as they happen. So I think that's where it comes in. And when you talk, and very correctly so when you say that I fix myself very consciously in my class and sort of locational space very firmly, I think I do that very consciously. Because I do not want to comment on something which probably I'm not familiar with, or I don't know, or I will only have to guess at. So I don't do that. Having said that, doesn't mean I will not. And like I said, more research, more nuanced understanding, yes. And what was the third?
Agenda or story?
Agenda or story? I think both. So, like I said, the agendas are very much there. I mean, I cannot not be a feminist. I cannot not be somebody who's very conscious about the gender politics. I cannot not be somebody who doesn't understand or deals with, because of the kind of reading or thing that one does with the caste politics and the gender politics and so on. So yeah, so it was everything. And Naxalbari was something I was working on, in fact. So a lot of people have actually asked me, how does a story from the Naxal movement come into your volume, because this was before your times. So I was working at IIS on a research. So that's when I talked to some Naxal women and interviewed them, and then saw the way they were sort of prisoners of their own fame, or infame, or whatever you'll call it, and how within that structure also, how they were treated as women, and not as comrades, which the outer world saw them as. So, the repression is not merely, in a domestic space. It is also there in this very, very sort of political space, where technically you've given up your home and you're living in the villages to give politics, as they said, and at that very radical time, you were being suppressed because you were a woman. So I was very aware of all of that, and I think that's where the story comes from.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Wow, that was a lot of ground covered, but I still have a niggle in my head, which started with our long 2-hour exploration of your book 2 years ago when you first wrote it. And that is, and I have the right two people here that I know in the academic world. One is Shangjukta Di and one is Harish. Not to put two of you at gunpoint, but at some stage I will give you a few minutes to think about it while I, work the floor. But today I was made to think of this issue. Adil Jusawala, the poet, who's now on to his 80s, Adil Jusawala, the poet, now on to his 80s, is setting up a consortium of people who are going to be on fast. They're going to be in Bhopal working against the dowry deaths, which have they have hit an all-time high, and weddings which are by force, to ensure that. Now, we have two instances in this book, and one of them is this Bela and the sister-in-laws, right, which you were talking about. It does not tantamount to not having to spend for a second dowry. There are places in India where it doesn't matter if you've married the third sister, you're still going to get, huge amount of money. So when all this is still so much happening, such a reality, and we write these stories to make us aware of the reality, and does reality really bite? Do we really find a way? What are we doing by being social critics as fiction writers? Okay, I'll leave that in their hands for now. But no, I do want you to, but you have to, I'll give you time to think about it. I want us to think about something more happy, like the very accessible style, or the strategic kind of thinking, how a character would contribute to their own empowerment in their lives. So, before I turn it over to anybody else, would Anju Munshi and Anasuya Pal have a go at it, since you know the book backwards, I hope by now?
Hi, Nandini, and congratulations on this. We read your book a long time back, we did enjoy reading it, and yes, there were 11 stories. And what struck me at that time, which of course, when we discussed it with you, was the absolute non presence of feminist men, because that was one factor that, in fact, I noticed and had a disquiet about. And I think I would like to just take it a little forward and take it to the point where there's non-representation of the millennial girl. I just wanted to say that all of these stories talked about some form of marginalization of the woman, and a step that she perhaps took for her own liberation. And I feel that in today's world, while we are talking about dowry deaths and we are talking about second marriages, yes, they are happening, but the 20th century woman who you have written about is a parent to the millennial today, okay, and they are transferring their learnings to their millennial children. So there is a growing crop of children who are empowered and who believe that they don't need to be protected by a father, then by a husband, then by the son, if they get one or not. They're choosing to live their lives singly, on their own, not needing to be supported or protected by a man. So I feel that this is giving birth to perhaps that kind of an empowered woman story in the future, perhaps for you. And I mean, we are talking a lot about the Nobonitas and the other. I particularly liked Hama's story, and even the one about Keke. And it was something that laid the foundation for something to expect from you in the future as an outcome of what you have said over here.
I'm not from Bengal, but I'm a Bengali at heart. I love fish, rice, adda, and debate. I come from the north, and before I came to Bengal, it was always a trauma to get into marketplaces, colleges, universities, boarding buses. It was never a safe feeling. It was always like being hounded, you know. So there was a huge gender disparity and all that. Once I came into Bengal, it was like breathing easy. It was a different climate of dignity and respectability. And I found things very, very different from what I had encountered, you know, before I came here. In reading your book, I found a reaffirmation of all the kind of feelings I experienced in the year, I think, 1992. Because it was a very different world for me. It was a climate of dignity. It was an air of respectability for women. Everybody referred to you as Didi. There was no being jostled anywhere, however thick the crowds used to be, however, whatever kind of mayhem it used to be, from puja to whatever, weddings and, you know, like traffic jams. So reading your book was like going back so many years and remembering the kind of, you know, what do I say, the purity of feelings which I experienced once I came to Bengal. Your women characters are certainly empowered, especially when I look at it from my perspective. I have grown up, I come from a very different place. And it was heartening. I think I enjoyed reading all the women characters that you have. There is a kind of a strength they have. There is a kind of, you know, a dignified, like you used two phrases which I liked. One was gender politics and one was a feminist consciousness, yeah. So I think I quite enjoyed, and your book brought these two things alive, and thank you so much. All the best.
Would you like to? Okay. Do you want me to respond? Respond, and then Anish can have the mic.
Yeah, I think let me get in here because I'm in the.
Dr. Mehta, please let her respond. Thank you.
So thank you. So thank you so much to both of you, and I think I would completely agree with everything that both of you said. And as far as the millennium girl, millennium woman we are talking about, and this empowered contemporary woman who does not need a man to live by, and so. While I think it's great, I know girls like that within the family, outside of it, my students. Again, there are so many aspects to it. So just not having a man, or just being able to stay till very late at night, does not mean that you're empowered, or does not mean that you have arrived. So there is a lot that still needs to be done, and there's a lot, and there's a huge fight that is still happening. But like I always say, we walked over our mother's shoulders. So what my grandmother did, my mother enjoyed. What my mother did, I have enjoyed. And I don't have a daughter of my own, but my students, the girls who I impact, the women who I see, I want them to take it forward. So I'm sure all of us are doing just that. But having said that, that doesn't mean our battle has been won by any stretch of imagination. It's something that we have to do continually, because the very fact, you just pick up the newspaper and you read the news. Now, these so-called empowered, even if I were to call them empowered, what is the percentage of girls like that? And when you open the newspapers, or if you even scroll through the news, kind of news that you are reading, I don't even want to go there. There was a time when we used to read about rape and feel shocked. Today we read about rape and just turn the pages. It's such a common given thing. And then again, the question of who has been raped. So when it was Nirbhaya, because of a certain caste class politics, people did rise up. When I don't want to name, but there are so many that we see nothing happening. So. And then who are we to say what is the real society and what is not? Because we are constantly grappling. So while there might be these women, and I'm so happy that they are there, but their sisters are not so lucky. Let me put it that way. So unless and until we have everyone, even if they can't be on the same page, but at least somewhere where they're progressing, I think we cannot say that we've arrived. And this is a theory of mine. It can be debunked. There are so many scholars here. I always feel that for us, feminism didn't work because we didn't take the streets for feminism at any given point of time, unlike the West. They fought. Somehow our fights have always been very class-based. An example that I give, if all the domestic helps were to go today on a strike, would the likes of us go and join them? I wonder. Some of us would, most of us wouldn't, because our houses are running because of them. You and I are able to sit and have this scholarly discussion here for 2 hours because there's somebody taking care of my house. So I think there is that class boundary, whether we acknowledge it, whether we don't, we're very much within that class. And we take positions vis-a-vis our class. Yeah, So till that gets sorted out in some way, until we take to the streets to just fight for our rights. We do it sporadically. It's happening all the time. But where is a mass movement? I don't think it has happened. And I feel that's probably one reason why we have not arrived where we should have arrived. And we are still fighting, I hope, the good fight. And we'll have to keep fighting the good fight till we are somewhere where we can breathe easy. And I'm so happy when you say that you're breathing easy when you've come to Bengal. You guys are blessed. Like I said, I never lived here. So, but it's home.
Okay, so
yeah.
Dr. Harish Mehta and Dr. Shanmugha.
Yeah, I think there's a whole novel that you've just done, because you can fictionalize this whole thing about the lack of a feminist movement, and you can fictionalize it, beautifully there. But I think we live in a global world where women, the fact that women are being denied jobs, denied an equal share in the pie all across the world. It's not an Indian phenomenon. And the world that exists today is not just about rapes, individual ladies being raped, but armies raping entire villages, be it the Ukraine. We've seen this across many conflict areas. The United Nations has worked on these campaigns to prevent such war crimes. So it's a social crime when it happens in an individualized setting, but it becomes a war crime when it happens in an organized manner, when armies go on the rampage. Do I have a question? Yeah, I think my question for you as a writer would be setting an agenda and then approaching a work of pure fiction can be problematic. In fact, as a work of pure fiction, the story has to just find its own way. A character just you may think that a rape has to happen on page 65, but the publisher might want to see the rape happening on page 1, because if it doesn't happen on page 1, you probably don't get published. You may have a love-making scene on page 82, but the publisher might want to see that on page 1.5, because he has to sell copies. So I think there's a whole problem in publishing today, where there's a whole the agendas are being set by people in a very fake manner in order to sell a certain product, so that the real issues get buried. And when you approach something with a real issue, it probably won't find a market.
I think I've asked you enough questions and spoken for quite some time. Actually, what we are hinting at is activist writing. Yes, and for me, as Julie pointed out, referring to my book, I consider whatever I write as activism, because that's the only thing I can do. I cannot go out there and wave placards, nor can I go out and address a huge public meeting. For me, to write, which is very restrictive. And one of my students is here who has gone into a field which is film. Film does not require a literate mind. A film can be just anybody can consume a film. And the reception will depend on the person, whether it's an intellectual, whether it's a literary person, whether it is absolutely a non-literate. And so your base is far bigger than what we do. And when you're writing in English, it again becomes a very, very niche domain. And so activism also becomes, what we are addressing and criticizing. Activism of English-speaking India is not going to work. Yes? Yes. And we have to go there because Mahashweta Devi has been an activist writer from the beginning. Yes? And which is why what now we are looking upon very creditably is the creative non-fiction. Yes, and we are looking at all those reference notes, which you find nowadays even Indian English writers using in a very big way. But once upon a time, it was all about imagining. However, contextualizing, historicizing, and also finding the factual and the actual in the text of representation, that is to bring ideas and imagination and the context together, probably is the agenda of the new writers. And that is what our young friend was trying to also indicate. And of course, I just see the PhD happening because the way you've written. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm getting little nudges from Nandini to say we've gone on. True, we've gone on, just fascinating. But please, anybody from the audience, if you'd like to make a comment, Madhuchanda's right here. Go ahead.
Just one one thing, since we were talking about Mahashweta Devi, this is a slight anecdote that I want to share. So long back, I had the privilege of interviewing her, and just as our friends here, they said no fan, and it was Kolkata, this kind of weather, no fan. There was only one fan in her room, and they switched it off. And we are sweating. The guy who's filming is sweating, and Mahashweta Devi is sitting and calmly talking, and then they would give us a 5-minute break or something. So in that 5-minute break, we're switching on the fan and doing this and doing all kinds of things. Mahashweta Devi picks up the phone and she starts calling Nondigra mein doctor lagbe, ekhune niye asho. And she was an octogenarian, well into her 80s, sitting ramrod state, making that phone call, while the rest of us are sweating and wanting the fan to come on. So all I want to say is that I so admire your fortitude for being so stoic about the weather condition currently. Marvelous audience. Yes.
Okay, I had a couple of questions and comments, but since we don't have time, I was very struck by your use of Macbeth in the story Performer, and especially being performed by a character called Javed, who's not even from the upper class. So if you could talk a little more about that, and also the idea of intertextuality, which again I see in several of the stories. And the other is the relation between skin color and sexuality, which I find marvelously subversive in your stories.
So I'll just put in another little spoke in Nandini's wheel. I not only like that reference to Macbeth, but the fact that she wanted to play Lady Macbeth to Javed's Macbeth.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thanks for that observation. So yes, so when that story happened and people read it, there was a lot of people telling me that we thought it was a romantic story. It was going to be a romantic story, and some people felt very cheated that it didn't turn out to be a romantic story. Now, being the realist that I am, I couldn't see a Gurgaon Mem Sahib, this fairly hoity-toity ones with my driver, my maid, my CA, they have everything, it's amazing. I couldn't see that the lady with everything that she had was, to land up falling in love with a cricket coach. Now, that would not happen. That would have been very romantic. I would have loved that romance, but no. So I knew what all could not happen. I knew that she could not go for Javed's sister's wedding because it is just not done. Mewat is bang next to Gurgaon. We don't even know that it exists unless something terrible happens there. So when you talk about Macbeth, I think Macbeth is that one play that sort of remains with everybody at all given points of time. There was no major sort of intention there, I think. But yes, the subversion that a character like Javed and his team would bring to a Shakespearean play, I think I did. The lusciousness of that I could not avoid, and her wanting to play Lady Macbeth was also part of. I could not allow them to. I could not see them romancing, though my heart would have loved it. So the next thing I could do, if at all, if it could happen, was to see them act together, and what would that be? So again, left to everyone's imagination.
So you're more conservative than D.H. Lawrence.
I would say more of a realist. More of a realist, yes. Did I answer both? Okay.
Yes, please. One of your students.
Yes, my student.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful evening. It is one of my, after so many days that I could meet Nandini ma'am. And yes, and it is really amazing to see such distinguished panelists. It is really amazing. Thank you for the observations. Ma'am, I have a question pretty much direct, that while you were writing the stories, 11 stories in, to be precise, you wrote the title of The Second Wife and Other Stories. So were you planning to give that title with another, did you had a second title in your mind, or this was only one title you had fixed?
Someone, I hate to disappoint you, but this is a title which I did not choose. Now that's where the publisher and the editor comes in. Now to make this luscious and When we did that reading at IIC, the COVID was letting up, and IIC had a very big hall, and the hall was full, and people were standing. And I think the opening comments that one of the very distinguished professors made was, "We have so many men here because of the title." and it was borne out today by a friend who wanted to come and said, "Amar to first wife in the second wife."
Ma'am, that is why I think so. The quote goes on like, "Don't judge a book by its cover only." So I do think that.
Yes, but there's the alta foot and the bull, so I don't think anybody would look at the book as a way to get the second wife.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was wonderful evening by the distinguished panelists. They have literally made my evening a very special sort of a thing, because mostly in online classes, as you know, we have very little interaction, and you take almost like 6 hours of classes to us. Thank you so much for that. It is really amazing sessions that you take. Thank you so much.
Salman, this makes me so happy. So he is part of my IGNU students. So I over weekends teach some IGNU classes, and what I love about the IGNU classes is people can join in from across the country. So what I absolutely love about the IGNU classes is that people join from across the country, and some of my IGNU students are here. You are my DU student. Acha, okay. So this makes me so happy that not only do people sort of know you across the country and they enjoy your classes, but the minute I said I was going to come to Kolkata, the Kolkata people who were attending my classes, and we don't see each other. It's not a classroom situation, but that love and affection is there. So feel so blessed. Yes.
So yeah, I've had the privilege of being her student in DU, and I do want to acknowledge what you said, ma'am, that what your grandmother did, your mother stands on that, and what your mother did, you stand on that. And yes, you do not have a daughter, but I am one of those students who stands on what you did. I have one very direct question, that of all your stories, what fascinated me was Kaikai's story. And in that sense, all the other stories are contemporary stories. This is a historical story, the only historical story in the book. And you chose a character who's not very debated. She's not Sita, she's not Draupadi, she's not even Urmila. What made you go to that character and that story?
Thanks for that. And like I said, I just feel so happy when I see my students. That said, so I keep forgetting. So why Kaikeyi? Now, Kaikeyi has always seemed a very enigmatic character to me. Now, on the one hand, we are told that she was very fond of of Ram, and she was very fond of. She was a good queen. She loved all of them equally, and she was getting dressed for his coronation, and she was happy and excited about it. And then apparently Monthora Dashi comes in and poisons her mind, and then everything goes topsy-turvy. Now it set me thinking that was she so facile, a woman who was a warrior? The reason why she got those 2 wishes was because she fought. She used to be, she was a warrior queen. She actually, helped her husband during a war. That is when he says you can have those 2 wishes. So somebody who, could fight, who could, she was very definitely a woman with brains from what we have seen earlier, to being deluded within minutes by her maid seemed very facile to me somehow. So I just thought, let me work a little on understanding her, and that's I think once I started engaging with her, just this simple complexity that it didn't seem sensible to me that a woman of her parts should be swayed just like that. So what would have happened? So what if she did not get swayed? What if there was a plan? And one thing I think probably all the stories show, I can somehow not look at women as weak and stupid and somebody with zero agency. That's the kind of womanhood I don't identify with. And so my women are very empowered and they have agency and there's sisterhood and so on. So that's from where I think the retelling of Kaikeyi happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Downstairs.
Oh yes, and I think we can just hang around and get pictures. I think they've been like the most fascinating audience ever. So thank you so much, all of you, and
So we
Thank
look
you so much.
forward to your next collection of short stories, and I hope you will not keep us waiting for too long, and where women want wives.
so there is a tradition in Africa and here as well. So yeah.
Second husband.
See, I see the gleam in his eyes already.
The fact that a woman doesn't have a wife at home.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't we all want a wife?
All of us need a wife at home.
Yes. So the whole,
The second husband and other soirees.
so the title is also been given.
So this is really about unpaid labor.
So thank you everyone.
Thank you.
This is the first of a few that we will have this year.